Tomorrow conference hosted by the Colégio Brasileiro de Altos Estudos. The industrial system improved the quality of life of millions of people. Laid on intensive use of fossil fuels, we transform the way humanity relates to nature. However, science informs us that this increasing consumption of fossil fuels will lead to a disaster, climate change. The energy transition to renewable is a central piece of the essential and urgent new dialogue between mankind and nature. As indicated in the recent International Energy Agency report, the energy transition to renewable must be accelerated. But a large share of the world population still lacks the supply of modern energy service. They need to obtain an acceptable standard of living. They need to increase the energy consumption. And another 2 million new inhabitants will join this population in the coming decades. To increase the supply for energy service for mankind while reducing the fossil fuel use is one of the critical challenges of our time. It can only be undertaken successfully if carried out cooperatively among all nations. Brazil shall have a relevant role in this cooperative effort. The Brazilian transition to renewable sources of energy was initiated cautiously in the 1970s. The role of fossil fuels in our energy matrix is relatively lower today, but a large share of Brazilians still have no access to the quality of life provided by the industrial system. If this is to change, the consumption of energy service shall increase in the coming years. With plenty of renewable sources, Brazil will become a large oil exporter of oil as well. The country faces the challenge of making its domestic transition to renewable sources while securing the oil supply for the global energy transition. Our aim in this seminar are two. First, to have a panorama of the desirable global energy transition. And second, to perceive the Brazil's role in this process. To help us navigate in this whole process of the energy transition, we will have a group of relevant researchers with large experience in the energy field. I will briefly present their views and what they intend to say. But if someone in the audience is interested in further information about them, please check out our web seminar. Our seminar will be held in 2 sessions. The first one starts now, and the second will start later on today at 2 o'clock Brazilian time. Each scholar will have 15 minutes presenting his views or her view. After that, we will have 5 minutes for each one of them to react to what they heard. And we follow up with the questions from the audience organized by the students who are technically supporting us today, this morning. Thank you all for being here with us, and I wish everyone to enjoy our seminar. Our program this morning has 2 very experienced speakers. Professor Gordon Mackerron on the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, a specialist on nuclear power. He worked for many years on energy policy issues, particularly in developing countries, and more recently on the 3 levels of sustainability, security, and access, affordability of supply of energy. Then we have Professor Quitzow. He's a research leader on the energy system and social change at the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, in Germany. His research focuses on sustainable innovation in industrial policy and the political economy of the global energy transition. And then we have Professor Roberto Schaeffer. He's professor at the Energy Planning Program at UFRJ, and he's associated editor of Energy and member of the Brazilian Academy of Science. We will explore various possible energy futures using the coffee integrated assessment model as a tool And he will end its presentation with a zoom on the Brazilian carbon neutral by 2050. So I give the floor for Gordon to start this meeting, and then in the afternoon I present the other two speakers. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon for me in the UK. I'm going to speak for something like 15 minutes. I don't have any slides. I just first of all want to check that I'm audible to everybody. Yeah? Good? Okay. I thought it was very interesting that Adilson and the organizers of this seminar talk about a desirable transition, which I think is a very important idea. In Europe, and especially in the UK, in recent times, we have increasingly been interested in what here we've tended to call a just transition, with a very explicit focus on questions of ethics, on questions of distribution, on questions of people who are marginalized, who might be left out or disadvantaged by an energy transition, especially if a transition involves prices that are higher for people who have very low incomes. So I'm very interested in the notion of a just transition, which I think is very compatible with the notion of a desirable transition. My own work and that of many other people here in Europe, we have been very interested in recent years in three different kinds of objectives for energy policy, which may be compatible. Background noise at the moment? Sorry. Is that okay? Okay. There are three different kinds of ambitions for energy. Clearly, one of them is sustainability within which climate change exists, and I shall come back to that. A second is energy security. And the third, which Adilson in a sense has already referred to, is the question of access to energy and the affordability of energy, which is a major issue for the poor in industrialized countries as well as for people in Brazil. I do think it's important first to say that although climate change is a critical issue within energy policy, it does exist within a wider question of sustainability. And I'll come back to that earlier in a few moments. I'm personally convinced that the urgency of the climate change issue is very real indeed, and that actions to be effective have to be taken within the next 10 years on a massive scale if we're to have any hope of meeting the ambitions that the international community has now got for emissions by the year 2050. One of the things that is often said, and with which I disagree, is something that in English we often call an all of the above view.
I'm sorry, Professor Gordon, your microphone is mute. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure how long it's been muted, but I think everyone was being muted for a moment. Okay, let me just go back a minute or two. The urgency is real. The actions we must take must be in the next 10 years on a massive scale if we're to have any hope of meeting the international community's ambitions for climate change by the year 2050. There are people who say that a consequence of this is that we must simultaneously develop all low carbon technologies, a view that is sometimes referred to as an all of the above view. My own view is that that is not a very good way of thinking about things. My own view is that we have to think about things operating at all levels. That is, from the individual to the community, to the regional, to the national, to the transnational, and the global. And what we need is action at all those levels. It may or may not necessarily include all technologies. And one note of caution about renewables: renewable technologies are clearly central to the transition. Sometimes people think about renewables as if they were infinite because there's a lot of sun and a lot of wind and a lot of water. The problem could arise, may even be arising already, that renewable technologies require quite complex capital equipment. And some of the ingredients for that capital equipment are substances that are relatively scarce, potentially quite expensive. So although renewables are central, we must not have the illusion that they are somehow infinite. And that, of course, draws attention to the enormous importance of energy efficiency and the reduction in energy demand, especially in the industrialized world, and possibly not to the same extent in a country like Brazil. So the rest of my talk, I want to illustrate this issue of the need for things to operate at all levels, community levels, political levels, and so on, by two particular kinds of, as it were, extreme examples, both of which I have some experience of. One is action at the very local community level. And I'll use a project which we did a few years ago in my local area of Brighton and Hove on the south coast of England, in which we investigated the effectiveness and, for that matter, the existence of community level activity, some of which was not very visible. And then I'm going to illustrate it at the very far opposite end of the spectrum, at the level of big technology, state action, international action, and that's the area of nuclear power, in which I happen to have specialized, and where both the UK and, as I read it, if I read it correctly, Brazil has, at least officially, some interest in the expansion over the next few years. So let me start by looking at some of the issues that are local and community-based. We started a project funded by the European Union that looked at how it might be possible to accelerate energy transitions through community and local action. And we conducted a case study in our local area. The city of Brighton and Hove has a population of roughly 275,000. We were surprised to discover that there were roughly 100 community initiatives that had something to do with sustainability and climate change, not always directly with energy, but an enormous level of activity, much of which was not widely publicized or certainly not known to a group of researchers who tried to monitor these issues quite closely. What I think we found was most interesting was that most of these issues concerned people who weren't necessarily interested in energy at all. They were interested in things like a better transport system, getting cheaper food, having more reliable electricity supply that they could afford. There were some energy issues. But actually, they started from a range of community problems. And energy came along, as it were, as a byproduct very often of that interest in a wider sustainability agenda, rather than being front and center of what the ambitions were. Without going into great detail, the areas which were most successful in terms of sustainability, in terms of accelerating a transition to a low carbon future, was in the area of food and agriculture. And this was enormously successful, unlike some of the other initiatives, and it allowed the embedding, as we put it, of more sustainable practices into the routine behaviors of, in this case, the local municipality. And that had a very big knock-on effect, because most of this food issue was about being local, it was about being organic, and it was about finding ways of eating less meat, which, as I think we all know, has a large spin-off effect on climate change, even if it isn't a directly energy issue. So my conclusion, briefly, in relation to this particular issue of local action, is that we cannot always locate it within an area of people who cared passionately about climate change, although many people did care passionately, but they also cared very passionately about their local communities, about including people who were marginal, about helping people who were having difficulty affording their energy bills, of improving bus services for people who lived in marginal communities who couldn't reach cheap sources of food, for example. And much of this fed back into the energy transition, but not all of it started from there. And that did seem to me to be an interesting and important finding of our work. The second area I wanted to look at is the area of nuclear power. Nuclear power is often the great unmentioned. It's the area that people often just simply ignore because it's been politically so difficult to find consensus. And the international system has found it very difficult to acknowledge the existence of nuclear power and whether or not nuclear power is a feasible and desirable part of the desirable or just energy transition. The first thing I'd like to say about nuclear power is that I have no ideological position either for or against nuclear power. But as an economist by original training, I've certainly looked at the economics as well as the politics of nuclear power rather closely. And that does seem to me, just to give you a preview of my conclusion, the Achilles heel, the big problem about nuclear power, has nearly always stemmed in the practical world of politics from economic issues. So let me make the assumption for now, it may be a heroic assumption, but let's assume there are no difficulties about the safety of nuclear power, that there are no difficulties about security, terrorism, proliferation, waste, and that all these things can be managed acceptably. And in some countries, they are managed acceptably. And then we simply look at what has been the performance of nuclear power and what is a reasonable expectation of its future. The first thing to say is, I'm sure many of you know, that certainly in Europe and in North America, in recent years, nuclear power has been spectacularly unsuccessful as an economic proposition. In the United States, some reactors have been closed down because the cost of operating them is actually greater than the cost of building a new gas-fired combined cycle plant. We're finding that even in France, the home of a dominant current nuclear technology, there is a project ongoing at the moment that is now around about 12 years late and is now at least 3 times over its initial quite high budget. And it's plain that we have similar problems in other parts of the United States. We have a problem similarly in the UK with a project that was due to be completed in the year 2017 and might, if we're lucky, now be completed in the year 2027. And the nuclear industry has recognized quite clearly that this kind of mega reactor is really not proving economically viable and has now moved to, and I know this is true to some extent for Brazil as well, to an enthusiasm for new kinds of reactors. And generally we can divide these into 2 categories. One is known as small modular reactors, which by international definition is a unit of less than 300 megawatts, about 5 times smaller than what we've currently been installing so unsuccessfully in recent years. And so-called advanced reactors, which is a very large group of potential reactors, many of which have been researched over the last 50 years or so without much commercial success. If we're talking about things that might have an impact by 2050, certain kinds of small modular reactors are feasible. The ones that are most feasible and most potentially commercialized within the next few years are all cut-down versions, small versions of existing well-tried technology, primarily pressurized water reactors. And they may well be possible to fabricate primarily in factories and not have the perils of on-site construction. But the economies of scale that we used to get by having larger reactors are, of course, being reversed. Each individual small modular reactor of this cut-down PWR type is inevitably going to be somewhat more expensive than a big one. Only if you could produce very large numbers of them and get the kinds of economies you get from semi-mass production in factories could you overcome that. The risk that you'd have to run by a prior commitment to such a huge investment program are very great. And in the UK, for an example, Rolls-Royce, the engineering company that leads the consortium here, is expecting the UK government to underwrite about £30 billion, 40 billion US dollars roughly, of small modular reactors, and none has yet been built. So there are real problems about small modular reactors if they use traditional designs, but they might be implemented relatively quickly. The other kinds of small modular reactors use relatively difficult, exotic, often very high temperature, gas-based molten salt. The technical details are not terribly important today. But they're reactors that even in enthusiasm in the UK for such reactors might start to be ready in the 2040s. But given the urgency of the next 10 years worth of investment, that seems like a very large amount of money, and it will be, for what will be at best a very delayed result. And some of those reactors are so-called advanced reactors. They're not all small and modular, but in all cases, the risks that we run by diverting a lot of resources to their development are very high indeed. And as I say, that is only to do with, I think, a realistic view of their economics, has nothing to do at all with the safety, security, the waste, the proliferation issues, which some people also find potentially problematic and lead to a difficulty of the acceptance of nuclear power in other countries. And I think I've said probably enough. I'm keen that we have time for questions and debate. I've used up about my quarter of an hour. And I'm happy to stop now. I apologize for not having had any slides, but I hope I've spoken slowly enough. My habit is to speak too quickly to be comprehensible. So I'm very happy to stop there and back to you, Adilson, to see what we should be doing next by way of comments or questions.
Thank you very much, Gordon, for your wonderful presentation. I think it was very enlightening about the situation that we have nowadays in Brazil. I think we're discussing the role of local communities in this process, and then, as you said, some interest in the way that nuclear power can in some way close the gap between the situation that we have nowadays and the position that we have before. So, many thanks once again. And let's hear now Rainy what he has to tell us about all these issues. Please, Rainy, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me see if I can manage to do this properly. Okay, I think you can see the screen as desired, right?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to be talking today about the energy transition as a global process of societal change. And when I say global, I do mean global, but I will also sort of infuse it with my European German perspective, which is ultimately my starting point. And so now I need to, sorry. So yeah, and when I say societal change, what I'm really talking about is the interplay between these four areas of action that I think are critical for enabling an energy transition. That's social development and behavior, politics and policy, economics and business, and technology and innovation. And I think it's really the interplay and the interaction between those fields that really, can either enable or constrain the continued transition to a climate-friendly energy system. And as I go through the talk, I'm going to be talking about these change processes in terms of different dimensions that they have and that they entail, different phases that they go through, and then identify some governance challenges that I see. When I do that, obviously, I'm not going to be able to cover everything in all aspects, but I'm going to try to sort of focus or bring out a few very critical issues that I identify. So starting out, I mean, of course, what we've seen now in terms of the energy transition, oftentimes it has been sort of synonymous, or has been used synonymous with the emergent transition in the power sector. So what we've actually seen in terms of energy transition has mainly been limited to the power sector. And we've seen that starting more or less at the time of the oil crisis, where the first phase of this was really a increased investment in renewable energy technologies. And this was sort of a process that was dominated or shaped very strongly by a number of very critical OECD countries, the most important ones probably Germany, Japan, and the United States. And they really, sort of brought forward the technology, but then we came to this second sort of phase, which I call bringing renewables to scale, which was kicked off by the introduction of the German Renewable Energy Act, or a little bit before that. With policies that really supported the deployment of larger scale investments, or the deployment of renewable energy and enabling larger investments in renewable energy installations. And what was critical really here was really the reduction of costs, right? And so it was really the question of bringing renewables to an industrial scale and allowing costs to come down. And here we really see that China became a very important player, adding to sort of the OECD countries that had initially sort of shaped, I would say, also the competition in renewables. And now, maybe with the Paris Agreement and the UK's pledge to phase out coal that came right before the Paris Agreement, I think we're entering a new phase of the transition in the power sector, which is that we've also recognized that it's not enough to just develop renewables, deploy renewables, but we actually also need to deal with phasing out fossil fuels. And in the electricity sector, the most urgent one is the coal-fired power generation. And we also are moving now to a larger scale deployment of renewables, which is possible because the technologies are now clearly cost competitive. So moving along, what we're the phases and this is we're gonna have to go beyond the power sector. And while I think large scale deployment of renewables will remain really the backbone of this global energy transition, it will have to be accompanied with the decarbonization of end use sectors. And that's ultimately about developing and scaling up electric mobility and other end use technologies also in the industrial sector and the heating sector, and then integrating those or allowing the integration of renewable electricity or other forms of climate-friendly electricity, which may be a solution in some contexts. And to do that, one of the things that needs to happen is also the scaling up of clean hydrogen and storage technologies to allow for this integration, which is important in both ways, both for the continued decarbonization of electricity and also for the decarbonization of the end-use sectors. And then at some point, we will also have to face the challenge of phasing out oil and gas, which, will also not happen by itself, just like coal. So, of course, there's also the issue of reducing energy demand. Gordon also mentioned that. I think is very critical because, yes, we have constraints on the deployment of renewables, and it's not just because of critical materials, but also because of land. The use of land is obviously an issue, water, other things that are important for allowing the deployment of renewables. So reducing energy demand and then therefore also changing behavior and using more efficient technologies is also part of this transition process. So now I'm going to go through some of the phases that you see here and sort of just pinpoint a few very critical challenges that I see for allowing this process to continue. So the first is, in Germany, we have actually very strong public support. You see on this graph here from a survey that we do every year in Germany that, basically almost over 90% of the population doesn't just support the energy transition, but actually wants to participate actively, or 82% also want to participate actively in this energy transition process. There's a huge public support, but nonetheless, when we see how the things are going with the deployment of wind energy, we see that due to sort of local resistance by those populations that are actually affected by this deployment, we see that this is really slowing down the deployment of wind energy. Also, grid expansion is being held up by the same phenomenon, which is then in turn slowing down wind energy deployment. So here is just one really critical issue, I think, is to deal with how to really develop these resources and develop these technologies in a way that is compatible with the local situation and that is is supported by local populations. This is a huge challenge going forward as we go to larger and larger amounts of renewable energy in the system. Also, this is not just this is sort of was more of a national German perspective, but obviously we also need to start deploying these technologies outside of rich countries and China, because that's really where investment and deployment has been concentrated for now. So we need to find ways to really scale up investment beyond those countries. And this has become even more challenging with the COVID-19 crisis, where we've seen quite substantial recovery packages, investment packages in advanced economies, but very little capacity to really mobilize resources in low-income countries, which will exacerbate the problem of mobilizing these investments, and is something that needs to be dealt with at the international level, I believe. Then coming to the phasing out of coal, I mean, this is something that in Germany has been tackled, albeit not necessarily satisfactorily if we look at the anticipated end date, but nonetheless, there is one now. but it's been very expensive. I mean, Germany is going to be spending over 70 billion euros on managing this process of structural change, but this is obviously beyond the capacity of most countries. But nonetheless, I think it's important to sort of highlight the need to develop approaches and processes for managing these structural change processes. It's been recognized in the European Union with the creation of the Just Transition mechanism that this is something that needs to be actively dealt with. And I think it's something that there hasn't been a lot of discussion about how this will happen in other contexts outside of, let's say, the European Union or the US, OECD countries. So another big issue to be tackled in the future, which includes also the big problem of continued financing coming mainly from Japan and China. Now, there have been some announcements that these countries will stop actually financing new coal projects, which is obviously undermining the process of phasing out coal. But this is not complete yet, and it remains also a big challenge to be dealt with going forward. Now I come to hydrogen. Hydrogen is one of the solutions for decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors, assuming that we use, obviously, climate-friendly hydrogen for decarbonizing processes like steel or chemical production, but also certain parts of the transport sector like aviation. This could play a role. But this process of scaling up, I think, is taking place in a different kind of geopolitical, geoeconomic context than the scaling up of renewable technologies 20 years ago. Germany is much more conscious of ensuring that these technologies are actually not just developed and deployed initially in Germany, but some of the value creation, some of the sort of industrial development and employment also stays in Germany. And this goes for all the big countries that are involved in this competitive race right now. And I think it will change very much the dynamics compared to what we saw 20 years ago with renewables, when this was much less of an issue. And on top of that, hydrogen is also attached to a big transporting issue because in the European Union, for instance, it's not feasible to actually produce the amounts of hydrogen that would be necessary to decarbonize the industrial sectors and produce low carbon industrial products. So it's also about importing hydrogen and creating transport infrastructure for that. And this involves very large investments and sort of agreements between different countries, similar to what maybe took place in the LNG sector, where you actually need political commitments. So we're gonna see, these kind of investment partnerships develop, which have an important political dimension, which obviously also gives this whole process of a geopolitical and a geoeconomic spin, which will have repercussions for how these infrastructures are developed. And then, of course, and this is another issue that's being hotly debated in the European context, is the question whether there should be only green renewable hydrogen, or also if there's also space for hydrogen based on natural gas and carbon capture and sequestration technologies. This is another question that will complicate the development of these technologies and the market development for these technologies. Germany has been very active in the last few years in developing its national hydrogen strategy. It's very much seen as an industrial policy and an innovation policy to also secure employment and value creation, like I said, in the future for the German economy. This is very much shaping its approach, which is it's an approach that is very much focused on green hydrogen, focused also on developing international markets and projects abroad, developing these partnerships that I spoke of, because Germany is only going to be able to produce a very small share of the hydrogen that the German government anticipates that is required for actually decarbonizing the hard to abate sectors that the strategy focuses on. So one part of this strategy, as a result, is quite a significant venture into funding green hydrogen projects outside of Germany. There's going to be funding schemes for this that are going to come out in the next few months. And there are also ongoing discussions with a number of countries, Chile, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Brazil, Ukraine, Canada, Morocco, for developing these kinds of partnerships that I was mentioning, for catalyzing the investments in these technologies, bringing them to scale, but then also linking them to investments in transport infrastructure going forward. And finally, this whole hydrogen sort of discussion and the development of these strategies in a number of countries is also very much related to geopolitics, like I said, to geoeconomics, questions of competition between leaders in low carbon technologies, including China, the US, European Union, but also Japan and Australia as important players. And in a way, it's a little bit of a foreshadowing, I think, of one of the very big challenges that it's hard to sort of tackle and address, and that's the question of phasing out oil and gas, because it raises a lot of questions about what will happen to countries that right now are very reliant on these exports, and what are the political implications, what are the implications for security, for in areas of influence that different countries have. And so, like I said, it's kind of foreshadowing this, because if you saw that list of countries that Germany is cooperating with, Saudi Arabia is one important player. There's the Ukraine, but also there's a lot of discussions with Russia that are developing now. And there's really an effort to try to see if hydrogen can be an entry point for really moving these countries also on a path towards climate-friendly economic development. I don't have any answers on how else that can be done, but the problem is that this is probably just a very small piece of that puzzle. But it is, I think, an important piece of the puzzle that if it's ignored, then it can very seriously hamper the energy transition going forward. So I will close here. I'm not sure how long I spoke, and looking forward to the discussion.
Many thanks, Henry. Wonderful presentation, very nice, very clear, and clear presentation of the challenge that you have ahead, and in particular the view that is coming from Germany and Europe in general on how we can move forward. It's clear that we need to move forward, although there are many questions. Changing the way you use energy services are definitely quite the decision that we have to make now to avoid the problems that climate change will produce to us later on. This already Gordon showed us problems with water supply and all of the things. So thank you very much for your nice presentation. And I think now we're going to have a very clear view of some modeling that has been made by people here in Brazil, and I think Roberto is going to highlight us on this aspect. Please.
Thank you very much, Adilson. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those in Europe. Let me try to share my screen here. Can you see my screen already?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here. Let me try to be brief here. Let's discuss this issue of energy transition and the challenge to the 21st century. It's a pleasure for me to share this discussion here with Professor Gordon, with Rainer. It's really a pleasure. Okay, brief introduction here. There are various possible tomorrows, and because of that, for sure, there are various possible energy transitions. So this is very much related to a question that Anna Cloud has just put on this. Anna Seri has just put on the chat a few minutes ago. But for sure, let's say there are some tomorrows that are probably more desirable than others. And as a consequence, probably there are some energy transitions that are more desirable than other energy transitions as well. So what I'm going to be focused here is very briefly on discuss a possible, let's say, desirable future for the world and a possible desirable future for Brazil. And then we're going to show that some
Roberto, for me it's frozen. Is it for everybody?
Yeah, Roberto's not there.
Roberto's not there. You don't know what happened.
Okay, let's see.
Robson, do you know if there is any problem with Roberto?
Okay, let's
We'll come
ask him.
back for sure.
Yeah, he will come back just in a minute.
I'm sorry for that. These are the problems that we have with this sort of conference.
Adilson, do you have his contact in WhatsApp? Because I do not. So you could send a message by WhatsApp so he can return as soon as possible.
I have to look to my phone.
There's a problem with his connection, probably, most probably.
Let me see. This. Schaeffer. Yes, I don't have him. I'm trying to find his number here.
Okay, he will come.
Mariana Zotinho, você tem o telefone dele, Mariana? Mariana é aluna dele, deve ter. Talvez ela possa entrar em contato com ele.
I will try to contact him and I'll let you know.
Okay, excellent.
I know. I'm so sorry for that. But perhaps you can explore a little bit what you heard already. So it seems that it's clear that the idea of nuclear is very controversial. And as Gordon suggests to us, it's not a very easy pick as far as the financial problems concerned, and also its technological problems. There are also problems related to how to control the diffusion. Oh, was this guy? Wonderful. Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I'm sorry, problem with my internet here. I'm using my wife's phone. Let's see if it's gonna work well. Let me go back to my presentation. Sorry for that. Can you see again the presentation?
Yeah.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm sorry for that. I guess I was presenting this slide here. So basically, I was talking about, let's say, the dynamics of a different energy transitions are related to technical economic aspects, like life cycle of different technologies, learning mechanisms, clusters, path dependence, and lock-ins, public policies for technological diffusion. But also, we have to have in mind, let's say, different relations of power, like geopolitical rivalry, commercial rivalry, social conflicts, and also, for sure, we have some natural limits as well, like scarcity of superabundance of natural resources, environmental degradation. So basically, if you put all these pieces together, this explained a little bit past, let's say, energy transitions, and somehow is going to help us understand a possible future energy transition. So what I'm trying to say here is exactly that. I think during the past energy transitions, there were clear private benefits, both for producers and consumers switching to new energy sources. So there are benefits for switching from wood to coal, coal to oil, and then from oil to electrification. So there are clear, let's say, private benefits in doing that. But let's say the energy transition I talk about now, let's say this low carbon energy transition that's going to be required is not that clear. What are the private benefits associated with that? Not mandatorily, let's say, wind, solar, or electric vehicles, from a private point of view, is better than what we had before. So that's why, let's say, when you think about this future energy transition that's going to be necessary, we have to have in mind, let's say, that we're going to need to manage or engineer this future energy transition, because this transition is not going to it's not going to happen by itself. My approach here, let me very briefly discuss global and national scenarios using, let's say, Brazil as a case study. In order to be able to produce the future scenarios for the globe and for Brazil, we have to rely on models. And in my case, I'm going to rely on integrated assessment models, some tools that we have developed in our group in university during the past 20 years. So basically we have, let's say, a global CG model, which is global, a computable general equilibrium model, so as to create scenarios for the globe from a macroeconomic point of view. So we're running scenarios up to 2100. Then we have the coffee model, which is a global linear programming optimization model that somehow, based on the T model, you can see what's the demand, let's say, demand vector for energy services, for transportation, for food, etc., that's going to be required from now up to 2100. And then we have the BLUES model, which is a national integrated assessment model that somehow going to show, okay, based on a desirable future for the globe, what would be a desirable future for Brazil? So this is our approach. In the case of the globe, okay, let's talk about one possible desirable future for the globe. For example, if you want to comply with the Paris Agreement, one possible desirable future would be a future where we would keep global warming to below 1.5 degree centigrade. So this is exactly what I'm showing here. So you can see here on the right, let's say, what would be the temperature outcome of this scenario that I'm exploring here. So you see that with a 50% chance, we're going to end up 2100 with a temperature around 1.4 degrees warmer than in the pre-industrial era. But if you want to work, let's say, play much safer, there's a 67% chance that we're going to end the century with a temperature around 1.6 degrees. In order to reach those temperatures, one possible desirable future would be to see what we have in here, would be basically almost to phase out fossil fuels by 2070, basically greatly increase the role of land use change. So afforestation, reforestation will have to play an important role. Then you have also the important role to be played by bats, biomass with carbon capture and storage. And also, if you can see here, the red, let's say, area here, which is basically the possibility of having an industry with negative emissions if you begin to produce products coming out of biomass. So in that case, you can have a kind of bio-CCS in the product itself, and then you can have an industry that's negative in terms of emissions. That kind of desirable future, how you would look like, let's say, in terms of primary energy. So we can see here in terms of primary energy, fossil fuels going down, some nuclear increasing over time, biomass becoming extremely important, and also, as expected, let's say, renewables becoming more important. From the point of view of final energy mix, we see that basically, let's say, the possibility here is to electrify everything that can be electrified, okay? But also see some role to be played by hydrogen, and very important role to be played by liquids, that in this case are going to be liquids not coming from fossil fuels anymore, but basically liquids coming out of renewable energy. And then we look in the very right-hand side here, we see what would be the profile of the power sector. So we see here the profile of this power sector would be basically, let's say, phasing out fossil fuels without CCS, some fossil fuel with CCS, nuclear becoming more important, but even more important, renewables in general. In that case, we're talking about non-bio-renewables, but we're talking about solar and wind mostly. Okay, so this is one possible desirable future for the globe, with some implications, environmental implications, cost implications, etc., etc. What about, let's say, a possible desirable future for Brazil? So in this case here, I'm not going to go into details, but I'm going to be exploring, in fact, here, a 1.5 degree compatible scenario for Brazil. So basically, let's say, I had that global run showing what would be a global, let's say, a globe, let's say, compared with a 1.5 degree globe. And then I can see the role of Brazil into that globe. And then I use, let's say, the carbon budget associated with that Brazil inside that globe to put as a constraint in my national model to see what kind of solution this national model would find for Brazil. So in that case, it's funny to see that basically a Brazil compatible with a global 1.5 degree world is very much a Brazil that will be net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 or net zero CO2 emissions by 2040. And that's why now, from now on, I'm going to be talking more about net zero 2050, because very much the same scenario for a Brazil compatible with a 1.5 degree globe. So in that case, how Brazil would look like in this scenario of being net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 or net zero CO2 by 2040. So basically what we see here is biomass become extremely important in Brazil. And the reason for that is not because Brazil needs biomass, it's because Brazil and the globe needs negative emissions to compensate those sectors that are really hard to abate. So basically see here, let's say, a very substantive reduction in fossil fuel consumption in Brazil, oil, coal, and gas, and a great increase in wind, solar, and sugarcane bagasse, and also electricity demand increasing dramatically simply because we try to electrify. Everything can be electrified, but also we have to rely on biofuels because we need to have negative emissions or BECCS coming out of this sector. In the case of the oil and gas sector, how the picture looks like. So in this scenario, net zero by 2050, basically we see that a great reduction in imports and production of oil in Brazil, but an increase in oil exports. So basically we see most of the oil produced in Brazil, it's going to be less than what we produce today, are going to be devoted for exports, and basically because the domestic market is going to rely heavily on renewable energy. So basically we see here this increase in exports of oil. And what's very significant here, if you look on the very right hand of my slide here, is the dramatic reduction in the utilization factor of oil refineries in Brazil. So starting 2040, we have, let's say, a utilization factor of our refineries going down to 19% in 2045 and going down to 5% in 2050. Funny enough, these are exactly the numbers shown 2 weeks ago by the International Energy Agency for the global oil sector. Basically, a very dramatic reduction in utilization factors of refinery. And why? Basically because we're going to try to adapt those refineries to process or co-process products coming out of biomass. So it's very dramatic, the impact of that on the oil sector. What about biofuels? In the case of biofuels, all scenarios here show, let's say, that advanced biofuels are going to be very critical to be deployed in those sectors that are difficult to decarbonize, mostly aviation and shipping. Let's say in the case of aviation, it's very difficult to decarbonize. Let's say you cannot electrify a ship as of today. You cannot electrify an airplane as of today. Hydrogen is extremely dangerous to be used in an airplane. Anyone that has ever worked in an oil refinery knows that you try to be as far as possible of a hydrogen pipeline as possible because it's very dangerous. So I doubt that any time in the future you're going to have hydrogen in airplanes because it's too dangerous to do that. Anyway, so basically what we see here is that biofuels or advanced biofuels become really critical in the case of Brazil. But why? Because we're not going to rely anymore on first or second generation ethanol, but we're going to need to have ethanol with bio-CCS. We're going to be able to produce bio-kerosene with bio-CCS. We're going to be able to produce biodiesel with CCS. And that's why, let's say, we have to rely so heavily on biomass, exactly because we can rely, or we have to rely on the negative emissions that can come out of this biofuel. So basically, see over time a almost complete replacement of all fossil fuels in Brazil by biofuels in those sectors that you cannot electrify. So in the case of mobility, for example, cars, trucks, and buses, this is much easier to electrify, but it's not easy to electrify a ship. It's not easy to electrify an airplane. Implications of that, implications in terms of investments, let's say. Huge investments will be needed in biofuels because we're talking about advanced biofuels, huge investments for biorefineries, and also investments in land use change because we have to use forest and reforestation or forestation as a way to compensate those sectors that are difficult to abate. Okay, based on this scenario, what are the risks and opportunities for Brazil? I'm not going to read this, of course, but great opportunities for the power sector, wind and solar, and also cogeneration with sugarcane bagasse, but some risks associated as well with our heavy reliance on hydroelectricity because of the vulnerability of hydroelectricity to climate change. So this is something we have to have in mind. In the case of oil and gas, the opportunities are to repurpose the refineries to co-process biomass and also a much greater integration with petrochemicals. And the risks are associated with much lower demand for oil products and also this problem of very low utilization for refineries. In the case of biofuels, great opportunities for biorefineries, let's say great opportunity, let's say for carbon capture and storage in the production of biofuels. And the risks are very much associated that although Brazil sees biofuels as an interesting solution for the country, the globe, Europe, US, and Japan does not see biofuels as a great opportunity for various reasons, but the fact is that then we have here a conflict. The best solution for Brazil in the biofuel sector is probably not what's seen by Europe, US, and Japan as the best solution for the globe. So here we have a tension that we have to have in mind. I'm not going to discuss agriculture and land use because it's a different issue. My final comments here. Okay, so what I can say is that, let's say, transition scenarios that limit global warming to lower levels imply, and as others have said, insignificant energy and land use system transformations over the coming decades. So this for sure, we're going to see dramatic system transformations. This will lead to significant reductions in fossil fuel use, major investments in low-carbon energy carriers, and also major investments in energy efficiency efforts, as was already discussed before. We have a problem here with institutional and technological lock-ins associated with carbon-intensive infrastructure, which is a major risk arising from, let's say, delaying mitigation action. So the issue of stranded assets is a key issue here, and somehow we need to work with that. And again, the International Energy Agency 2 weeks ago said exactly the same. So this presentation of mine was prepared before the International Energy Agency because they rely on my modeling exercise. So somehow the International Energy Agency is simply confirming results that we already had. So finally, I can say that a desirable tomorrow for the global energy transition may differ from a desirable tomorrow for the Brazilian energy transition. But not much can be done about that unless Brazil begins to pay proper attention to environmental issues. Why I'm saying that is simply because we just finished a project now trying to, let's say, discuss with IMO, International Maritime Organization, a possible future for shipping fuels. And basically, some studies coming from Europe, they indicate ammonia and hydrogen as the best solution. And our studies show exactly the opposite, that ammonia is a very bad solution and hydrogen is even worse than that. But why they are showing that? Simply because given the current environmental policy in Brazil these days, it's difficult really to see biofuels as a sustainable option, simply because, let's say, Brazil, unfortunately, is not paying proper attention for the environment. And in that case, Brazil may lose this fight, not because biofuels are bad, but because we are not being able to show that biofuels can be a good solution for Brazil and also for the globe. Thank you very much. Sorry for my technical problems.
Many thanks, Roberto. Wonderful presentation, very interesting and challenging, because you can see that the perception that we have here in Brazil, at least from the presentation that Roberto showed us, is very different from the one that are coming from abroad, which is leading to the good question, can Brazil in some way be part of a cooperative program, international program in global warming, or Brazil is going to take a very peculiar or perhaps a specific approach to that. And I think Roberto showed us very clearly that in our case, we have a much stronger view on biofuels than we can see elsewhere. And this is, it's a bit a challenge as he presented us. How can Brazil convince the world that our solution is the best solution for the world and not the solution that are coming from the north, let's say particularly hydrogen or nuclear or anything else for the solution. So with this in mind, I think we have a very nice true presentation, different perceptions, and I think it's now time for the floor for our two speakers to react to what they heard from each other. And I can perhaps start with Gordon. You saw that our friend from Germany has a very strong view on the chances of hydrogen. We saw that Roberto has a very strong view against it. And you, in some way, you had a balanced view in your presentation. How do you react to all this and all these things? And how do you see, I think, particularly the role of cooperation among countries, because the meeting that we're going to have in next November in COP27, if I remember, is begin exactly how can we cooperate on that? And as our President Biden now decided to rejoin the Paris Agreement, I think we're going to see a very nice dialogue between the North and the South on this issue. So let me hear from you what you think about what you heard.
Adilson, thank you. And thank you very much to the other two speakers. And my first comment is really, and it applies to me as much as to the other two speakers, is that we spend a very large amount of time, much of it completely justifiable, comparing the relative merits of green and blue hydrogen or biofuels versus solar photovoltaics. And these are all very important. I think I made a one-sentence reference to issues of energy demand and energy efficiency. Let me react to, I think one of the people has made a message on the chat as well. And I think it's very important that we don't lose sight of the issue of energy efficiency and energy demand reduction. It's clear that, Adilson, from your early comments, there are many people in Brazil who cannot yet get the benefits of modern energy use to enable them to participate fully in the modern world, and that has to be taken account of. But even if it means that energy demand has to rise in some places, providing energy with greater levels of efficiency is absolutely critical. And nearly all our debates, whether they're going to be about international cooperation at the next COP or anywhere else, do tend to devolve into comparisons of different technologies, supply technologies. And of course, those matter very much. But we have, I think, not spent remotely enough time thinking about how we control energy demand, how we improve energy efficiency, because answer to one of the questions on the chat was, is there a model, a template for everyone? And I think one of the answers that we heard was, no, there isn't. But the one common element is we have to be caring about energy demand and energy efficiency. And that will take different forms. That is common, I think, to all transitions, but tends to be debated less. And I'm as guilty as anybody today of not being very involved in that issue either. I think that's probably all for me. I'm not a specialist in hydrogen. I am interested to know what everyone thinks about hydrogen, because it does seem to be deeply controversial, and some people think it terribly problematic, others as tremendously useful. But I think that's enough from me, at least for the moment.
Rainer, may I perhaps join put another question in this debate? The previous transition were top-down transitions. It means that a few companies, oil companies, in some way driven. First the coal companies, then very strong oligopoly has driven all the transitions. So they manage it from the top to the bottom. Now it seems that we're coming as a more bottom-up transition. It means that the communities, as Gordon suggests to us, is the communities that are looking, in particular, I've seen very clear this at this moment with the pandemic, is the communities that are trying to find a solution for their lives. And so this is the way they look to energy is a different way. It's not the companies that's going to force them using prices and regulations to use oil or coal. Now we have much more, as Gordon said, is a demand driven, coming from the top, from the bottom to the up, and we're having now governments and society and institutions that the government were trying to find out how they can manage this new transition. It's not a transition that's going to be governed by companies, but will be governed by communities. Do you think this is relevant for our case? Please, your floor. You have the floor.
Okay. I think I'll get to that in a second. I just wanted to say that I agreed, obviously, with the importance of reducing energy demand. I do think there's also a little bit of a question of how we use energy, not just how much of it we use, because due to the variability of renewable energy, there are actually some moments where electricity is quite abundantly available, and then other moments where it is not. So there's also some questions, at least in the German context, where it's a question of who should be prioritized at certain points in time when there's little, and how can we manage this kind of energy use at different times when there's abundance and when there's scarcity. I think that's something that also requires some new thinking on what we expect from the energy system as users, as societies, and there could be new ways of managing that, where this idea of energy security being a sort of total and absolute concept where you always have to have access to electricity at all times may be something that we need to break out of and rearrange. So that could be sort of another dimension to this question of energy demand. The question of bottom up and top down, I think that there have been important elements of a bottom up process in developing renewables, at least in Germany, but also in other places. And I think that was a very important part of at the beginning of the process. But I think more and more, this is not going to be enough. We're not going to manage this process purely from the bottom up. There's going to have to be some top-down regulations, some top-down decisions that then require, obviously, dialogue and engagement with populations, with users, with companies. So I think it's kind of a back and forth that's needed, and there's a need for embedding, especially this deployment of renewables in sustainable local processes. And also room for a lot of experimentation still in doing so. And then finally, just to sort of touch on this hydrogen issue, I don't know exactly, I was not aware of this strong controversy regarding hydrogen, to be very honest. But the understanding, in very much clear and strong understanding in I think the European Union but also specifically in Germany, is that hydrogen is a solution for very specific applications. So it's definitely not envisioned to be a solution for personal cars or things that can be electrified, like Roberto said. I mean, electrification is seen as the first sort of way to go, but then for certain industrial processes, like steel, this has been identified as the most promising option. And then sort of going to this question of biofuels or hydrogen, I'm a strong believer in innovation and also the role of competition in innovation. So I think that if solutions develop dynamically in large sort of markets like Brazil, and they prove to be successful, then they will diffuse. Because I think what everybody wants is the solutions to be cost effective, on top of obviously being effective at mitigating climate change. That said, I mean, I think that clearly, and I also said that in my presentation, is the whole hydrogen hype is also an industrial policy project. I mean, there is definitely an industrial policy motivation. It's seen as a new field where value creation will take place going forward. And therefore, a number of countries, and Germany is one of them, have really been very active at sort of pushing this forward, because not just because I think it's the solution for everything, but because it's a solution where they see themselves positioning their economies as front runners and as technology leaders going forward. So, I mean, that's very much the reality. But like I said, I don't think that this necessarily has to only be a bad thing. I mean, competition and this pressure coming from competitive dynamics can also be a good thing, and can lead to developments taking place quicker than they might otherwise. So this would be sort of my take on that discussion.
Thank you. It seems that we're having a very nice. It's a seminar where having different views and different from the ones that we had before, much more, let's say, controversial. At least
maybe I can just add one more thing, just about the Brazil-Germany thing, because I think that this has actually been quite a problem in the cooperation between Brazil and Germany. I don't think that there's actually such a conflict of interest, because I think that these things are complementary. But I think that in the cooperation that we've actually seen, there's been a lot of talking past each other. You know, Germany only wants to talk about renewable electricity, and Brazil wants to talk also about biofuels. And then if people don't, if that discussion actually needs to involve people listening to each other and not just talking about what they want to do. So I think this has been a problem specifically in the Brazilian-German cooperation, not in all the situation, but specifically Brazil and Germany. That's been a problem. And maybe going forward, this should be sort of a change in mindset in trying to make things actually more productive and constructive.
Very good. I totally agree with you. There is no. The best approach is not to stick to our own position, but try to find out what are the possibilities, the opportunities that are open from the dialogue, not trying to convince each other that my idea is the best one and your idea is not the good one. Now, coming back to Roberto, I think it's interesting because sorry, we have two nice questions, in fact. The first one is, as he pointed out, the use of biofuels means that we are going to use a lot of land and water And nowadays we're having a big dispute between land users that produces crops and the water that's going is used to generate electricity. And this is a major dispute nowadays because, as I said earlier in this morning, in our conversation, that nowadays we're facing the risk of rationing of power in Brazil because the hydro reservoirs are relatively empty, or very, very empty. And I would like to see how Roberto reacts to this problem. One, and the second problem is can we have flights coming over to Brazil, ships coming over to Brazil, if we decide not to use the same fuels that are used elsewhere? If we decide to use biofuels for our flights and for our ships, how can we trade with other countries? How can our flights go to other countries when they need to fuel and come back and then they have the biofuel there to how can we imagine this sort of problems? This is a sort of dialogue that Rainer was telling us that I have to try to find out a way of dialogue and not trying to convince each other that we are the best solution. We have to, we live in a global world and we need to talk to each other. So Roberto, please, with this provocations, let me see what you react to this, all these things that we heard this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adilson. Let me answer those two questions that you raised to me, but before that, let me also comment on the previous ones. About comment by Gordon. Fully agree with you, Gordon. Let's say it's much easier, let's say, to discuss supply scenarios than demand scenarios. Because, let's say, if you talk about energy supply scenario, you talk about technologies, okay? And if you talk about demand scenarios, then there's the issue of behavior. So, in our integrated assessment models, this issue is also factored in, but there are some problems doing that. For example, it's very difficult, and we're beginning to do that, to incorporate climate change into our models. Meaning that higher temperatures would mean a much higher demand for cooling in developing countries. So energy demand will grow substantially. We have a couple of papers on that because of climate change. More cooling will be needed, so electricity consumption will go substantially higher than it is today. As of today, we have more than 1 billion people without access to electricity in the world. So if you try to incorporate those people into the market, energy demand will grow to meet those minimum demands for them. So putting all these things together, and also this issue of the future of mobility. Because of the pandemic, many people are coming back to their private cars now because they don't want to use private transportation anymore. So energy demand will go up as well. So it's much easier to deal with energy demand from the technological point of view, but extremely difficult to deal with the behavior side of the equation. That's why in our model, we try to do that. Future demand in our case is much lower by GDP, by dollar of GDP than the current state. But even in that case, we see that it's very likely that energy demand will grow into the future. But it's part of our considerations as well. Another important issue about this issue of hydrogen and nuclear, etc., etc. I try to answer that in the chat here. The problem with hydrogen is that hydrogen is not an energy source. It's an energy carrier. So you have to produce hydrogen. So the amount of energy you put, let's say the molecule, the hydrogen in the air or hydrogen in water is a very stable chemical compound. So you spend more energy to get hydrogen from water than the energy in hydrogen itself. That's why from an energy balance point of view, hydrogen is not a good solution. Hydrogen is a very good solution as a way to storage energy. So it's a different thing. You can use hydrogen when you have excess wind on solar, and you can, instead of simply not using that excess wind and solar, then you can produce hydrogen to save that energy for the future. But you pay a very high energy penalty on doing that. So that's why, let's say, hydrogen, as was said by Rainer, has very specific niches in that case, and I think that storage is one of those niches. Why our model does not like that much hydrogen? Because when you talk about climate change, you're not talking about CO2 only. You're talking about CO2 and other greenhouse gases, methane, N2O, etc., which are gases that you cannot abate. In the case of agriculture, in the case of, let's say, animal husbandry, you're always going to have, let's say, N2O from agriculture because of fertilizers, and you're going to have methane also from agriculture and also for animal husbandry. How to abate non-CO2 gases when your CO2 go to zero? So you're going to have positive emissions, so you're not stopping the temperature of warming. So you have to have negative emissions to compensate for positive non-CO2 emissions. And that's why, in that case, biofuels play that role, which is the possibility, it's the only case you can have. Afforestation, reforestation are another possibility, and then biofuels. To have negative emissions, because you can capture the CO2, the biogenic CO2 that was stored in the biomass or in this tree, etc., to capture that and incorporate that into products, chemicals, etc., etc. So in that case, you have negative emissions. A hydrogen economy is a positive emissions economy. So you're not going, if you have a full hydrogen economy, you're going to have global warming going up because you have non-CO2 gas that are going to play a role. And that's why in our case, it's interesting. We see hydrogen for light-duty vehicles being used in fuel cells. We have developed, in fact, our University of Federal University of Rio, has a couple of patents, which are the first ones in the world, on direct fuel cells. You put direct ethanol into a fuel cell, and then you take the hydrogen and have an electric vehicle running on biofuels in a fuel cell. So that's why, let's say again, nothing against hydrogen, but I see the difficulties, the technical difficulties, the danger of doing that. It's very complicated to import and export hydrogen because, let's say, you have to have very special alloys to be, because otherwise you have the hydrogen molecule that's very small. It's going to enter into your let's say, it's very complicated. So hydrogen is very complicated to transfer. Okay, having said that, about land, water implications of biofuels. The first thing, let's say, the kind of biofuels that our model sees are not the biofuels that the Brazilian government would like to see. Because the biofuel sector in Brazil is still think that ethanol for cars has a future, that biodiesel for trucks and buses has a future. We don't see that as a future, simply because these are the sectors or technologies that can be electrified. The real use for biofuels are where you cannot electrify them. But what about land and water? First thing, biofuels in Brazil are not irrigated. In Brazil, most of agriculture in Brazil is not irrigated agriculture. You use natural rain-fed, so there's not a competition between biofuels and water. About land, also this is not an issue in the case of Brazil. For you to know, those that are not familiar, the agriculture, Brazil is the second largest producer or exporter of agricultural products in the world. And to do that, you use 70 million hectares of land. Cattle alone in Brazil uses 200 hectares of land. Biofuels today in Brazil uses around 10 million hectares of land. So we're talking about 10 million hectares of land for biofuels. Agriculture is 70 and cattle is 200 million hectares. So what our model does is basically to intensify cattle so that you can release between 100 and 170 million hectares of land for more agriculture, and then you also have space for biofuels. So no competition in the case, or you don't need to have competition. A different issue is whether or not you have competition. It's completely crazy that you have some biofuels producers in Brazil that want to produce biofuels in the Amazon. This is completely, doesn't make any sense. So, but you don't need to do that. Let's say you have enough land so that if you handle better the issue of cattle, you can release huge amounts of land for more forests and also for more agriculture. And in that case, you have some space for biofuels. About the second question about Adilson, let's say, what about a ship that comes to Brazil and goes back? In fact, it's quite the opposite, Adilson. You cannot have a ship running on ammonia, on hydrogen, and arrive in Brazil and then going back using fuel oil or something like that. But when you have biofuels, then you can have drop-in biofuels. So all fuels that I'm talking about here are drop-in biofuels, meaning that you can use, it has exactly the same molecule of the current shipping fuels you use today. So you can go to Saudi Arabia and use oil there, come back here and use a drop-in, let's say, biofuels in Brazil. So this is not an issue. What we see for the future, and we work a lot with shipping these days, is that probably you're going to have some shipping routes dedicated to some specific fuels. So let's say, in the case of Europe, probably the shipping routes inside Europe are going to be using ammonia. Then other shipping routes between, let's say, Asia and South America probably going to be using drop-in biofuels so that they can use different fuels. But more important than that, most ships today do not fill their tanks when they go and when they come back. Most ships, in the case of Brazil, for example, they only put fuel in their tanks when they arrive in Singapore, because let's say, the shipping fuel there is much cheaper. So what I'm saying that, so ships today are able to go a round trip, let's say, with the same amount of fuel they carry inside them. So this, just say that it's not a problem. You can either, let's say, only fill the tank here and go and come back, or if you use, as we are proposing, we're studying, drop-in fuels, so that you can put any combination of fuels in a ship, provided that it's not hydrogen and not ammonia, because in that case, you're talking about a completely different kind of motorization. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Very nice. So we have now a clear view of different perspectives of the energy transition. The Brazilian one, let's say, the one that's coming from Europe, and particularly we have a view of what's coming on from Europe in general. Today, in the afternoon, we're going to have a view of how the United, in particular North America, is looking for this, and how the oil industry in Brazil is looking to the issue as well. And we're going to have a view of the role of particular wind energy and wind energy, offshore wind energy in the Brazilian energy transition. I think it's just to highlight what's going to come next this afternoon. Let me, before passing the person that's coming from the audience, let me ask one another question which is interesting from my point of view, is the fact that at least here in Brazil and here and also elsewhere, there is a huge transformation in the transportation system in cities in general. So people are working more at home and needing much less using transportation to go. And so in particular, the transportation companies, city transportation companies, but we are facing huge financial troubles because the drop in the people that are using their community traveling is really making them in a very huge financial trouble. Do you think this is something that's going to stay? And if it's going to stay, this is going to have a huge role on very important role on the problem of energy transition. It means if really cities are going to be transformed in the way that we saw in this particular year and a half, this is going to have a major impact on the transition, energy transition, or you think this is just a drop or a particular situation that is going on, is going to move as soon as we come back to what they call the normal life, this will come back also people traveling much more than they used to travel before. Please.
Can I just ask one question of clarification? Then Gordon, I think, wanted to answer. But so you're asking about the use of personal cars as a result of COVID? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Personal cars, traveling for holidays, and all these things that we used to do very
More generally. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, let me start, if I may. I think we just, the short answer is we really don't know. I think it likely that, but this is purely personal speculation, not the result of any research, there will be more meetings like this one. I think fewer of us will make very long distance journeys for relatively short-term results. That, I suspect, might reduce the amount of international travel, whether it's business or academia, that can be done more or less effectively by remote means, by electronic means. My own casual observation of my home city and the UK is that we seem to have less private cars, but we seem to have an awful lot more movement of food and goods in commercial vehicles, and an enormous expansion in the number of people using motorcycles to deliver food to people. Whether that's a long-term trend or not, I don't know, but I have a strong suspicion that the amount of reduction in transportation is perhaps less than we think, and that we will get back to something close to normal, but with a possible caveat that really long-distance travel may be reduced for, in a way, straightforward financial reasons apart from anything else. That would be my rather subjective reaction, and I don't think any of us really knows very clearly what will happen.
I do. Should I add to that?
Yeah.
I mean, my perspective, I agree. I mean, obviously, we don't know, but I think I would say that it can only really have a positive effect, and I'll explain why. I think that ultimately nothing has changed. We're going to need regulatory approaches. We're going to need some kind of intervention to solve these kinds of problems, also in inner cities, also for the mobility transition. We're not going to be able to go out without that. People are just not going to sort of by themselves decide that they don't want to use their cars anymore to travel and, with their families. I have 3 kids. I mean, I don't have a car, but it's much easier, to do certain things with a car. So we're not going to change that. But through COVID-19 and all the changes, we've been forced to try out new things. Okay, we've been forced to try out new things, and this has allowed us to see certain new ways that things can be done. So that doesn't take away the necessity to make certain sort of create the regulatory environment and the framework conditions that push us towards a climate-friendly mobility system, but it maybe gives us new options and new opportunities to do so. And the Zoom meetings are one. People have learned about using that. It's a possibility we have now. In Berlin, the government used the window of opportunity there's less traffic, so they basically just blocked a lot of lanes on the streets and made bike lanes out of them because there was no sort of resistance to it in this kind of phase, and they're probably going to stay. Lots of them, and yes, I mean people have kind of reverted to the car, I think, because obviously you don't want to use public transportation, but this will go back to normal, right? I mean, I don't think people are going to, avoid public transport once that problem is gone. I mean, that problem has then gone away. So why would they continue to do that? So this is kind of my perspective. I think that it should allow us to sort of see new ways of doing things, and this includes also the delivery business, which obviously has gone up, but the delivery sector is also a space where you can move, I think, more easily to sort of lightweight vehicles, electrified vehicles. It's actually not that hard to make that change more climate friendly. So if that increases and other travel decreases, then maybe that's not such a bad thing either.
Adilson, let me comment
Roberto.
very briefly on that. For sure, Gordon, nobody knows. Nobody knows what's going to happen. I guess, my guess is as well, we're going to have more, non-motorized transportation in the future. So bicycles are becoming more popular for sure. Walking is becoming more popular. But then, as Adilson said, because of the COVID-19 crisis, lots of people are simply not using public transportation anymore. And because of these new technologies like Uber, etc., in the near future, driverless cars, chances are that those that are not using public transportation anymore will not go back to public transportation anymore. These services are becoming so cheap now. We see in the case of Brazil, lots of people that have never taken a taxi now only use Uber. These people were using public transportation before, and they are not using anymore because Uber is too cheap and they can afford it. So this is one issue that I think we have to have in mind. The second thing is the following. Public transportation is not so well developed in most countries of the world. Europe is really an exception. In the US, you don't have public transportation. In Brazil, it's very poor. So it's the incentive to build infrastructure now on public transportation that was in the minds of governments in a few years ago, I don't think they're in the minds anymore, because chances are they're going to have infrastructure that nobody's going to use. So there's a risk here that these, let's say, people not using public transport anymore, it's going to be very difficult to go back to that. Another issue is these new technologies, driverless cars, etc., lots of people are considering the possibility of living much far from home, from their work than before. Because if you have a driverless car, basically you don't need to be concerned whether or not you're going to take 1 or 2 hours to go to your workplace. Because if you're connected in a driverless car, you can do exactly your work in the seat of the car without driving it, than to go to the office and do the work in there. So I know people that now say, okay, if I can, let's say, have a driverless car or rent one, why I need to live close to my workspace? Because if I take 1 hour to get there, I can already work inside my car. So I don't need to worry about living far or near where I work, because I'm going to work in the car anyway. So again, I'm just saying that nobody knows the future of transportation, but I agree with Gordon. Chances are that international traveling will really go down, but a lot of domestic travel will probably increase. And also, even if you reduce energy consumption for transportation, you're going to increase energy consumption because people are staying longer at home. So it's very complicated. Now you can, even in Brazil, you can buy something from Amazon and they deliver to your home in the same day, even if it's a book, and then you have a small truck coming to your home to bring you a book because you don't want to wait, let's say, 2 or 3 days to get your book. So what you're going to see probably is less fuel being used for transport, for let's say for passenger transportation, and much higher energy use for goods transportation, because you already see that you can buy anything from the internet, and then a 5 or 10 ton truck stops in front of your home to bring you a 100 grams book because you cannot wait a couple of days to see that book. So I think it's difficult to see what's the future, but I think energy consumption in transportation will increase, but going to change, let's say, from, passengers to freight. And even in the case of passenger, we have to think about public versus private transportation. Thank you.
Okay, let me come to the questions that are coming from the audience. And the first one goes to Gordon. Mario Vitor asks the following question. Bill Gates is proposing a nuclear solution. Any comments on his proposal?
Yes, they're quite short. Bill Gates is a great enthusiast for technology, and this is often very effective. In this case, I think quite the opposite. There are some novel elements in the technologies that may be developed by TerraPower, but it's still fast reactors, it's still liquid sodium, it's still a lot of potential safety issues, which the publicity from Bill Gates seems to completely overlook. And I think, as Roberto has already indicated, there are very few people who are anyway specialized in this field who really take it terribly seriously. And I'm exactly of that view as well. I don't think it's something that's going to run.
Another question, this is from Professor Marcela Castro. For any one of you, perhaps the three. Do you think that it does exist an ideal energy matrix, in the sense that there is a benchmark technological solution? In other words, technology is the solution, or the energy matrix will be the specific to natural resources competencies and institutional advances of the country. In other words, it's going to be a country-specific solution, or it's going to be a global solution. We are here dealing with this idea that there is no, as somebody said for the pandemic, there is no local solution. Is there a local solution for the energy problem? Any one of you that want to work on this particular question?
I can comment very briefly, Adilson. I somehow already answered that in the chat. I don't think there's a single solution for all countries, and basically all the discussions here are related to that. So I think most solutions are going to be country specific, and sometimes even, let's say, community specific. Let's say, depending upon whether or not, let's say, you have good energy, let's say, solar and wind resources nearby. Eventually, if you have or not, let's say, biofuels nearby. So I don't think there's a single solution. Let's say technologies are global. Let's say electric cars are electric cars, airplanes are airplanes. But even when you talk about an electric car, it doesn't matter what's the origin of the electricity that goes into your car. If it's solar, if it's wind, if it's something else, even an electric car can run on biofuels if you have a fuel cell electric car. So again, not going to be long here, I think you're going to see more and more local solutions to deal with a global problem.
Just add something briefly. And I already said, I think, that I thought the one common element, apart from the fact, as Roberto says, that different technologies are, in some senses, common across the world. An aeroplane is the same thing pretty much anywhere. What we've heard today illustrates quite graphically how different the solutions are going to be. I mean, Brazil is a country with an enormous amount of potential uses of land, some of them climate friendly, some of them climate unfriendly. UK simply doesn't. But the UK has a very large coast. It has an awful lot of wind. Inevitably, in a country like the UK, wind power is going to be a major element in any strategy. And there will be local variations as well on a much smaller scale, some of which I've already referred to in terms of community-based projects, whether energy motivated or not. So I do think there will be huge variety, and local circumstances, either big geography, Brazil, or small geography, local water resources will play an enormously variable role in different contexts and different places.
Okay, and a question perhaps to we understood that Germany is very, very interested on hydrogen. Do you have for this technological solution? Do you have any idea why is Germany so close to this solution? Why they don't think of something different? There is any particular in your presentation? I think you said that hydrogen has an advantage for Germany because you want to lead the technology on this particular issue. This is the main point. Is it really technological push, or there is any other aspect of the issue?
Well, I think I said that because, I mean, to be honest, I mean, you can't do everything at the same time. So if you do something, I think there's a tendency, and that makes a lot of sense, to work on something where you think your country, the place where you're coming from can be a leader, can sort of develop economic benefits out of that. So that's one part of the solution, one part of the story. But I think maybe this is also a question to Roberto, but also Gordon. I mean, I think one of the main sort of pressures that has led up to the development of hydrogen is also the recognition that if we want to get to climate neutrality by 2050, we need to very rapidly decarbonize the industrial sector. And in steel and chemicals and in some other sectors, this is seen by the industry as the way to go to actually produce green steel, for instance. So I'm curious to hear what the other solutions are that are being ignored, because my understanding is that this is very much the strategy that the industry has staked out for decarbonizing these industries, and that is the main target for hydrogen in the strategy. I mean, it's a very clear focus on that. Second, after that are certain transport applications like aviation through synthetic fuels as an option, which is different than biofuels, but I think also something reasonable to think about. And I also think that the decarbonization of the aviation sector is at such an early stage. I mean, sure, if biofuels end up being the solution and this proves to be the much more efficient and more cost-effective and viable solution, I don't think anybody will have a problem with that in Europe. I think everybody will say, okay, great, we don't have to import as much hydrogen. We don't have to make as many investment partnerships as we were thinking. We can focus on, I don't know, only 50 or 70% of what we were anticipating, and we have a solution for aviation. I mean, of course, then the only thing that might come on top of that are some energy security issues, where, if you become very dependent on, I don't know, a source of biofuels that you feel like that makes you very vulnerable, that might be an issue. But on the other hand, green hydrogen is not going to be produced in large amounts in Europe either. So that vulnerability will be the same. So I don't really necessarily see that also being a major factor. So ultimately what I'm trying to say is, I don't think that there's much of a concern that it's not that people are trying to exclude other options. It just seems to be the option that people see as the most promising, and for certain hard to abate applications. And if other solutions are found for certain things, that will just simply make the task a little bit easier. I don't think people are going to complain if we might make ourselves less import dependent, right?
Good. In some way, you're answering. I think there was a very good point made by Leonardo Gulamar, said that a global solution doesn't mean a single solution. It means that perhaps we can have different solutions at different countries or different regions, but it's the global problem can solve not necessarily one single solution, let's say one technology or one particular approach. We can have different ones, which I think it's a good point, but it's interesting some way you address it. You are saying the same thing as Roberto and Gordon, that it can have not necessarily many different approaches, different solutions for different regions, and solve the global problem that is how to reduce global warming. So this is.
But could we follow up with I would like to hear what's the Brazilian take on decarbonizing the steel industry? Like what's the strategy, and how is it going to happen? I mean, what's the technological option if it's not hydrogen?
Okay, let me explain to that. In fact, I don't know if you know, but almost 50% of all steel produced in Brazil are already decarbonized because we use charcoal, we don't use coal. So we already have, let's say, biomass or charcoal being used in the steel industry. So this is one thing. So that's why, let's say, you have, a very highly decarbonized steel in Brazil. The second issue have to do, let's say, in the future, once infrastructure is ready, let's say you can have full electric steel mills, provided that we work from scrap, meaning that you can recycle steel to produce new steel. So this one. But also more important than that, and we're working on that, I did not present results here today, is the following. We don't need, let's say, oil, coal, or gas, but we need energy services, meaning that you can see what's the best energy carrier for your energy service. We don't need, let's say, beef or broccoli or potato, but we need food services, so you can have a mix of. And you don't need steel, mandatorily. We need, let's say, materials services. And that's why in our integrated models now, we have the possibility of providing options for the model to choose the best material to meet a specific target. Some targets have to be made of steel, for sure. But many others, you don't need steel. Let's say, you don't need steel for a car anymore. You don't need steel for many things. So that's why, in the end, I think steel is going to be, that part of steel, it's going to be much more than we have today. It's going to be produced part from charcoal, one possibility, part using hydrogen, you're right. But probably the demand for steel is going to be much, much less than it's today, because many things that are made of steel today do not need to be made of steel. You can use, let's say, many composites to do that. Plastics and many things that, I don't have almost anything at my home being made of steel anymore. My laptop is not made of steel anymore. My car has many parts made of plastics. So even, let's say, houses, not a big apartment building, but houses do not need, let's say, steel anymore. You can, as in US, you use wood for houses, and many 2, 3, or 4 store apartment buildings also do not need steel anymore. So in the future, I think the demand for steel is going to be much, much less than today, because you have other materials that can also play the role steel plays today.
And then you see, for the chemical sector, you see it as a fully bio-based chemical sector, not hydrogen-based.
Yes, and the reason for that is because you already have the infrastructure in place. It's extremely easy to adapt. We do this in Brazil, in Europe, in France, we have already done that. It's extremely easy to adapt an existing refinery to co-produce any fuel you want from biofuels. So that's why, let's say, the investment to make this transition is going to be much lower than expected, because the infrastructure is in there. Let's say the storage for biofuels is exactly the same storage for fossil fuels. The pipelines are exactly the same. And even the refineries, with small changes, you can very easily co-produce. We do that. Let's say we produce, let's say, you can produce gasoline from biofuels. You can produce naphtha from biofuels. You can produce aviation kerosene from biofuels. So you can produce anything from biofuels inside a biorefinery.
And have you had these discussions with, I don't know, industrial players in Europe? What do they say to that?
We have a great cooperation with IFP in France, and they are in contact with different oil companies which are beginning to do that. In the US, you also have some oil companies beginning to convert their refineries to produce or co-produce biofuels. And even in Brazil, we have some units that already do that.
So you see that there is a lot of optimism here with biofuels. It's different from the perspective that you have in Europe. I have one final question, perhaps to all of you, related to a point that was made by Gordon and also Wayne and also Roberto, is how in some way we didn't pay too much attention to the problem of energy efficiency. And this is something that we need to much more close look. And in some way, I think this idea of between fossil fuels, hydrogen, biofuels is related to the problem of efficiency, as Roberto was telling us that it's much more efficient to use biofuels. Now, our policies, our energy policies all around the world has always been the following. The role of the government is to push for plenty of energy supply and cheap energy supply. So this was the main objective of government. How can I induce companies to produce a lot of energy, surplus of energy, so people can use as much as they want, as cheap as possible it can be, and this was the policy. To which extent this sort of policy is still relevant for the world of today? We have, and as you can see, there's this idea of introducing global a global tax on fossil fuels. And there was a lot of reaction in different countries. In France, for instance, the Gilets jaunes, here in Brazil, the people from the transportation community. I saw many reactions to the idea of increasing tax on fossil fuels. But some people, particularly this report that I said earlier from the International Energy Institute, is pushing for the idea of an international global tax on fossil fuels that could be used exactly to reduce the problems that we have of imbalance between developing countries, poor countries, if we can use exactly the word, and the rich countries. So it's a way of transferring this financial resources that the people in the South can perhaps have a better access of efficient energy services. What do you think about this idea for the global global tax on fossil fuels?
Can I go first, Adilson, very briefly?
Yes.
Okay, now for sure, let's say, every time we talk about, let's say, a 1.5 degree world, 2 degree world, we're talking about, let's say, energy options that as of today are more costly than the current technology we use. So the only way to bridge this gap is to have a kind of carbon tax. So that if you begin to tax fuels by their carbon content, in that case, you can make, for example, wind, solar, or any other technology, hydrogen, nuclear, eventually more competitive than today. Without a kind of carbon tax, you are not going to solve that. Of course, you can have also mandates in terms of energy efficiency. Many countries do that. So I think also we can do much more in terms of energy efficiency, have minimum standards for various services, technology, etc., etc. But in the end, I think we're going to have some kind of carbon taxation that eventually the issue is, let's say, once you collect that money from a carbon tax, you have to think about what's the governance to make this money come back to the economy. The smart way to do that, you collect money from the CO2 tax, and then you re-inject that money to facilitate, let's say, different technologies, which are low carbon technologies, or to facilitate poor households that will need to pay more for energy because now energy is more expensive. But since we're in a market economy, the only way to solve that puzzle is to have a kind of market mechanism to make, let's say, low carbon technologies more competitive than they are today. So I think this is the way to go. My final comment, I think we're almost done here. Just to make sure, although it seems that I'm defending too much biofuels, is not the case. What I try to show here, let's say, from a technical point of view, biofuels is a good solution, okay, for some countries, not to all, of course, but the biofuels policy in Brazil is terrible. So I don't defend the biofuels policy of Brazil, but I defend a different policy that could make biofuels an interesting solution because of its drop-in characteristics for those countries that have the resources, provided that you don't have competition with food, provided that you don't have competition with water, provided that you don't have deforestation. Just to make clear here, let's say, I think Brazil is doing a terrible job with respect to its biofuels policy. It's not this one that I defend, but a one that I see that could be different, where biofuels can be an important energy carrier for a future low-carbon globe. Thank you.
Okay, shall I go next? Let me be very brief. I think carbon taxation, emissions trading has been effective in Europe. I don't think it's very likely a completely global fossil fuel or carbon tax could, politically speaking, be employed, but it's useful as one mechanism. Part of a bigger issue, which I haven't emphasized, but I think is important, is the issue that in the transition there will be losers as well as winners. And I think we'll only get an effective, just or desirable transition if we find better ways of thinking about how to compensate the losers. And the losers are a very diverse bunch of people. They might be oil companies, and they might be people who are very poor and live in marginalized communities. But to the extent that prices have to rise as an incentive mechanism, to the extent that that means that some companies go out of business or are threatened, we haven't thought enough internationally, nationally, and generally how to compensate the losers. And perhaps my final comment, and I just would like to stress it, that I very much agree with Roberto, who was talking about the difficulty of the transition, because effectively we're going from high quality fuels with high energy density and are very convenient and easy to use, oil and gas are the primary examples, towards relatively lower density fuels that are actually more problematic. And although there have been big advances in recent times, the fact is we're moving in some sense in the opposite direction from the historic direction. And of course, the historic direction was easy because, as Roberto says, it benefited everybody because these were easier, cheaper, more efficient ways of providing ourselves with energy services. And we mustn't lose sight of that as a fundamental issue that we have to find the best possible way to resolve.
Maybe just my comment on the carbon taxes. I think that carbon taxes are quite good for sort of incentivizing more climate-friendly behavior in the presence of existing solutions. So, you know, if there's a slightly more expensive solution that you can switch to, then, you know, a carbon tax is a great instrument for getting people to switch and do that. But it's not, I think, a very effective instrument for really catalyzing kind of the basic kind of investments in new technologies and new industrial processes that are required still in many areas, that just by imposing a carbon tax isn't going to sort of allow these technologies to magically appear. And so it's always just going to be one instrument among a whole set of instruments. And I do also fully agree that, you know, one very nice feature of the instrument is that you can generate revenues that you can then invest in the development of these technologies. So I think that's what we need to think about. And in terms of a global carbon tax, probably that's not going to happen anytime soon. But I mean, we are hearing very, very concrete, or I don't know how concrete, but some more advanced sort of discussions about smaller or groups of countries that would coordinate something like that beyond just the European Union as a set of countries that's already doing that. So I do think that might happen in the near future, and it might be an important sort of complement to a broader policy mix that will be needed.
Well, it seems that we're coming to the end of this session, but I have a final question that is coming now. Is in some way, people are saying the following. As you know, there is a lot of discussion nowadays about the role of the development banks, particularly the World Bank, the IDB, and here in Brazil, the National Development Bank. Some people are arguing that these banks have to change their focus. They should no longer be looking for development as itself, but looking to the climate change as their focus. What do you think about this idea of development is no longer a big problem, a big global problem, but the big global problem is really climate change?
Well, I can say something about that. I mean, or go ahead, Roberto.
No, go ahead, Ryan. Go ahead.
I mean, I was just going to say, of course. I mean, we need to invest in. I mean, let's put it this way: if we invest in sort of technologies and economic systems that are not viable in a decarbonized economic system of the future, we're not doing anybody sort of a favor, right? So we're just going to kind of kick the can down the road and then force actors into a situation where they have these stranded assets that we were talking about before. So I think we've clearly arrived at a point where if we don't think these things together, climate-friendly development and economic development more broadly, then we don't achieve either of them. So I think it's pretty clear that the development banks need to move towards this very, very rapidly. And I think the World Bank has been a little bit slow because also in the last years, I mean, the Trump administration as being, I mean, the US being the main sort of actor influencing the policies of the World Bank, with the Trump administration in place, it has been difficult to make further steps in that direction. But I think now with Biden, the way is kind of free for doing that. And I think we're going to see development banks moving much more quickly in that direction now.
Roberto?
Thank you. Let's say, I think, let's say, this is not a dilemma anymore. If in the past somehow, let's say, we used to talk about economic development and environmental development, this is really a very old view. Let's say. It's very clear now that it's not possible to have economic development without having environmental development. I have another hat. Let's say I work a lot with adaptation, with impacts of climate change. So it's not possible anymore to have economic development without dealing with climate change. So in fact, I see that the focus is still economic development, but with the difference now that economic development now incorporates the environmental dimension. For example, the agricultural sector in Brazil today is the most important sector in the Brazilian economy. And climate change is already affecting agricultural production in Brazil. Climate change is already affecting power production in Brazil. So basically, I think the focus should be economic development, but the difference is that economic development now incorporates biodiversity, now incorporates air pollution, now incorporates climate change. So it's still economic development, but now we realize that's not possible to have economic development without a simultaneous environmental development. That's why I don't see any conflict here. It's still economic development, but with these new dimensions being part of the full equation.
I have nothing to add. Those are very, I think, very good responses. No more from me.
Okay, so I think we're coming to the close of our session. I don't know if I should give the floor for any one of you that would like to make a final remark, and then we move forward to there is anyone, Anna, Lavinia, anyone who would like to make a question or something like that. Otherwise, I hope Rainier, Gordon, Roberto, do you want to add any final conclusion to this meeting?
Well, I would just like to thank you for inviting me. I think it was a really interesting discussion, especially to learn more about the Brazilian perspective as articulated by Roberto, and I would very much welcome to sort of continue the discussion. Maybe we can organize something as somewhat of a panel discussion involving also some industrial actors from Germany, maybe a private sector representative from Brazil, and kind of continue this discussion. I think it would be an interesting debate to have also on the European side. I guess here the audience was more of a Brazilian audience, or maybe we can have a similar discussion with a more mixed audience. That would be interesting.
Excellent suggestion. Excellent suggestion. Let's do it. And Adilson.
Yes, we definitely will organize this. Gordon, you want to add anything else?
Just echo what Rainer has just said. Thank you very much for the invitation. I have learned a great deal. It would be great to carry this on in some form or other when we can.
Good. Roberto?
Just to thank you all. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure and honor for me to be here with Gordon and also Rainer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. No, just to thank you very much. It was a great panel, and I would like to ask everybody to open the video so we can see all of you, please. Yes. Hi, David.
Okay. Nice to have you all. Thank you very much and see you this afternoon.
Yes.
I'll see you all this afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. It was a nice opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Robinson, por favor, termine a gravação, sim, por favor.
Transmissão encerrada.
gravação parada.
The recording has stopped.
Ótimo. Então foi muito bom, né? Foi esse